Hello. Now can we hear second true confession? I've always wanted to walk up to Chariots of Fire. I'm an old track and field geek. I'm an old movie geek. In fact, just to let you know what you're dealing with today, other favorite movies, The Big Chill, St. Elmo's Fire, believe it or not, The Descendants, everyone's seen that, of course, right? And Ordinary People. So that's kind of the mentality you're dealing with. So would you join me in prayer? Father God, I just ask you to bless this conversation today. Bless all the men in this room who get up early every Wednesday morning to come here to learn a little bit more about you and how their life intersects with your pathway for their life. I ask you to bless this conversation this morning, that someone or many in this room pick up a little nugget that helps them as they traverse their life. We ask all this in your precious name. Amen. So thanks for being here. I'm really humbled to be up here in front of you. As I looked around the room this morning, there are so many people who are so much better qualified to be up here than I am. I saw Dick White in the back of the room, and I thought, wow, Dick could talk about contentment in work. Dick could talk about contentment in retirement. I saw Jim Beck in the room, and I thought Jim could sure talk about all these things a lot better than I could. And so a question started to percolate in my mind, and the question was, why on earth did Pastor Andy ask me to do this? Because I'm not exactly a poster child for contentment. I've had a lot of struggles in my life with that issue, but there had to be a reason he did this. Then I thought, well, maybe he's run out of speakers, and there's just not a lot of people left. And then I heard Michael Hurst is coming to the podium next week, so I thought, that's not the case. They haven't run out of speakers, so there must be some reason for me being up here this morning. So bear with me as we figure that out together, why I'm here this morning to talk about contentment. And oh, by the way, Andy slipped in retirement too, which I don't know if that's a hint that I need to think about retirement a little bit more aggressively or not. But here we are and here we go. So really interesting to me already I made the first mistake. I advanced a slide too far, but that's okay. We'll come back to it. The previous screen you saw a slide of Eric Liddell. Now the author, if you all read chapter 6, the author talked a lot about Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams. And Eric Liddell and Harold Abrahams were two wonderful runners. I mean, just world-class runners. In fact, both won gold medals. However, there was a difference in their approach. Harold Abrahams was a me guy, and I can really relate to this. He was a me guy in that everything was about him. Eric Liddell had a little bit of a different approach. Eric Liddell's approach was, this is all about glorifying God and how through my work, through the skills, the talent that God's given me, how's that work into my life and how it worked into his life. In fact, I think the author talked about this at one point in a conversation he had with his sister, talked about the fact that, Eric, why are you doing this racing? You should go be a missionary. And in essence, what he told her was, I am being a missionary by doing this. I'm spreading the word of Jesus Christ. And I found that really interesting. I found it interesting because here's a world-class athlete understanding the power of his podium. And he really got it where Harold Abrahams did. And we'll talk about that in just a second. But the author, now we're on the correct slide, the author had some interesting points to make. And the other interesting thing I thought about this is I was thinking about, again, why did Pastor Andy have me do this, is this chapter was exceedingly short, okay? I was talking with someone in the back of the room before getting started here. It was a 7-page chapter, so not a lot of material in there. I thought, well, maybe Andy was just setting me up because there's not a lot of material in chapter 6, but I think he had even a greater motive. So as we look at this, as we look at what the author is trying to say here, I find it interesting, and the first one is the poll number. I don't know if it's accurate or not. I thought about having people raise their hands, but how many people are satisfied with their job? And according to this author, 70% are dissatisfied with their job. I don't know if that's true or not, but I have a suspicion it's pretty close. And I can only speak on personal experience and through friends of mine's experiences. Maybe 70% are dissatisfied. I don't know if that's the case or not. I think also that as we go through this, and he makes this great point, he talks about God's will for our vocation. What is God's will for our vocation? I grew up, and you'll hear a little bit more about this in a few minutes, I grew up in the Roman Catholic tradition, and certainly if you had a vocation, that meant one thing, you were going to be a priest. You weren't thinking about the work world, you were thinking about being a priest. And so what's God's will for our vocation? That was a bit of a strange concept to me, what that could possibly mean. Another point he brought up that I thought was really interesting, the secret of contentment. Not what you want, but what you need. Oh my goodness. Not what we want, but what we need. I had this turned upside down. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. This wasn't a matter of not what I want, but what I need. This was a matter of what I wanted. And I don't know about any of you in this room this morning, but I suspect a lot of us has suffered from that plague of just continuing to pursue what we want and not even thinking about what we need. One other point he made, and I just thought this was pretty cool too. Our circumstances don't determine our commitment or our contentment, but our faith and trust in God do. I mentioned a few minutes ago that Eric Liddell was that guy. He was the guy who understood that point. He gave a speech at one point in the movie. If you may or may not remember, if you saw the movie, he didn't want to run in the Sabbath because that went against his personal beliefs. He gave a speech instead on the Sabbath, which was pretty remarkable. I wanted you to take a listen to this because I think the author did a wonderful job of tying this in to maybe why we run the race. And he talks about why he ran the race. Take a look. And that to me was a remarkable confession. How he ran the race. What did he talk about? Jesus Christ being front and center in your life. The author goes on to quote a verse, which I'm not real comfortable with. He talks about 2 Corinthians, and there were so many verses that I wish the author would have quoted. I wish he would have talked about, Jeremy talked last week about Romans 8:28. I wish he would have talked about Philippians 4:6. I think we heard that a little bit earlier. I wish he would have talked about Philippians 4:13. I wish he would have talked about Psalms 46:10, but he chose not to. He talked this difficult verse, and this is very difficult to me because, quite frankly, I have a problem with it. You know, when I'm weak, I am strong. For the longest time, that bothered me, that verse. But you know what? I'm learning to deal with that verse, and I want to come back to that in a few minutes. So, the author's overwhelming premise in this chapter is it God's will or is it man's will? Which is it? What are we dealing with, God's will or man's will? And I thought, okay, he's done a pretty good job of laying all this out. But again, there was something missing. Then it started coming to me why Andy maybe had me talking about this. And I think it was we needed to add a couple of different elements. I'm in violent agreement with everything the author said. I think the author just made some wonderful points. So Patrick M. Morley, good job. Great book, great chapter, okay? But it was missing a couple things. And I think what it was missing is a personal twist to it. I think what it was missing was some real-life testimony. So what I want to do for the next few minutes is talk about a couple things and how this impacted my life, because I think there's two things. We need to see how people experience something, but more importantly, how they grow from it. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit. I mentioned I'm kind of a movie geek. One of my favorite all-time movies, in addition to the 5 I mentioned earlier, is Dead Poets Society. And I don't know if any of you ever watched it, but it was a wonderful film. Robin Williams was in it, of course. He played a professor by the name of John Keating. In that film, John had some rather untraditional methods to teach. And in one scene, he goes after a guy by the name of J. Evans Pritchard, who is another scholar who wrote a book on literature and poetry. And so John Keating goes after him and with his students in a rather subtle way. And I kind of felt this when I was reading Patrick M. Morley. And I thought, you get it, but I'm not sure you get it. And so let's just take a look, and then I want to kind of turn the tide a little bit.
Gentlemen, open your text, page 21 of the introduction. Mr. Perry, will you read the opening paragraph of the preface entitled Understanding Poetry?
Understanding Poetry by Dr. J. Evans Pritchard, Ph.D. To fully understand poetry, we must first be fluent with its meter, rhyme, and figures of speech. Then ask two questions. One, how artfully has the objective of the poem been rendered? And two, how important is that objective? Question 1 rates the poem's perfection. Question 2 rates its importance. And once these questions have been answered, determining the poem's greatness becomes a relatively simple matter. If the poem's score for perfection is plotted on the horizontal of a graph, and its importance is plotted on the vertical, then calculating the total area of the poem yields the measure of its greatness. A sonnet by Byron might score high on the vertical, but only average on the horizontal. A Shakespearean sonnet, on the other hand, would score high both horizontally and vertically, yielding a massive total area, thereby revealing the poem to be truly great. As you proceed through the poetry in this book, practice this rating method. As your ability to evaluate poems in this manner grows, so will your enjoyment and understanding of poetry.
Excrement. That's what I think of Mr. J. Evans Pritchard. We're not laying pipe. We're talking about poetry.
So I didn't think excrement of Patrick M. Morley, but I did think he was missing a fundamental. And I think, again, maybe this is why Andy tapped me on the shoulder for this. So as I think back, and I think about, right there, surrender. As I think back in my life, it's become a pretty important element that we all need to consider. You know, how do we surrender? How do we surrender to Jesus? Because it literally has an impact on everything in our life. So I want to tell you a story today, and it's kind of a sad story. And after you hear the story, you may think, wow, he was really a jerk. And fully admitted, I was really a jerk for a long time in my life. And I think by the grace of God, I've come beyond that now, and you'll have to make that decision for yourself. But I want to go back in time a little bit. And so this guy you see on the screen, that's young Dave. And I don't know how old, maybe 6 or 7 years old or something like that, or maybe old enough to be looking at First Communion at that point. I had a really interesting childhood. I grew up, youngest of 5 children, single mom, no economic means, in Dubuque, Iowa. And by the way, if you grew up in Dubuque, Iowa, you were raised Catholic, of course. And so as we were growing up, I think my mother was had a desperate desire to find role models in my life. And one of those role models became a guy who none of you would ever know, none of you will ever think of the name again, is a guy by the name of Paul Heavey. He was a neighbor of ours who, Paul was a remarkable man in that he took us under his wing, but at the same time, Paul wasn't always the greatest philosopher and guide. I'll never forget, I was sitting with him watching a football game one weekend, and he looked at me, and it was the strangest thing, and he said, "David, people like us aren't meant to be rich." Now, I can tell you, as a competitive guy, that was like someone throwing the gauntlet down. It was time, game was on. And I kind of interpreted it as meaning, people like us, David, aren't meant to be rich and famous. So guess what my life's desire became? To be rich and famous. And boy, did I strike out a lot along the way, but I think you'll understand the story. So I became, in essence, a fraud from a very young age. Everything became about a calculation of how was someone going to read this action by me. That becomes quite a burden. So as I go through life, as I get through high school, I go on to college, I go up to St. Thomas in Minnesota, and I remember getting on campus there, having no idea what I was doing, but it was part of the image that I was building. I was going to a pretty good 4-year school, that's great. I remember having a conversation with my sister the first weekend and saying, she said, "What are you going to major in?" I said, "I'm not sure, we'll figure that out, but I know I'm going to get my PhD." And as I think back, why would I want my PhD other than it's one more check in the box, right? To have that pedigree behind you. I also read something in the student newspaper about this award they gave to seniors called the Tommy Award. At that time, it was Mr. Tommy, single-sex school, and so it was the Mr. Tommy Award, and it was given to the senior that best exemplifies what a Tommy is all about, and that meant through academics, extracurricular activities, sports, what have you. So from that point, my freshman year, I had one goal. I wanted to win this award my senior year. Pretty shallow, huh? And so, but everything I did was building up to that moment to try to win the award. How crazy, right? So, life goes on. I ended up finishing third, by the way. God had a funny way of sending a message to me in a really close race. Lost by 4 votes between 3 of us. As I think back, the 2 other gentlemen who were nominated and finalists for that, they deserved it. I mean, if you looked at their resume, they deserve this. Again, I was an imposter. As far as I was concerned, an absolute imposter. So from there, now the moment of truth came. What was I going to do? I had graduated. I didn't win this coveted award. And I started on the pathway of what's ahead in my life. So I went to grad school to kill a couple of years, went to Northern Iowa because I was training for the decathlon at the time. That was kind of fun. I was going to make the U.S. Olympic trials. Hepatitis got in the way of that. And that dream never came fulfilled. And I went back up to the Twin Cities and worked as a track coach and a sports information director. Now, the problem I had with that, twofold. One, I really enjoyed it. It was just having the time of my life. Two, it wasn't impressive enough. So here I'm having all kinds of impact on these young men that I was dealing with. I was enjoying the sports information piece, but it didn't measure up. It didn't measure up to the resume that I wanted to build. So there came a point where I was able to take a job in our development office because it had a title to it that said I was a national director for capital campaigns. Cool, that sounds a little bit more important than track coach, sounds a little bit more important than sports information director. So I was doing that for a couple of years, apparently did a reasonable job, and a headhunter called me and said, we've got this job in Des Moines, Iowa, raising money for the Dowling St. Joseph Foundation, something you might be interested in. And I said, sure, what title comes with it? Well, you'd be vice president for development. Okay, that sounds better than director, let's go that route. So, pack everyone up, we moved to Des Moines to do this. While in that job, I start meeting kind of the who's who of Des Moines, a lot of influential people associated with that board, and something strikes me that these people all have something in common, it seems, in Des Moines, Iowa. They're in the insurance and financial services business, and they all seem to be doing pretty well, and so I'm thinking, gosh, maybe I should pursue that. So fast forward, I joined the Marsh & McLennan companies through a friend and end up there for 17 years. Now, that really set the hook. That set the hook for everything I had been looking to for a long time, okay? Now suddenly, guess what? I had status, okay? I had income, I had status, I had all those great things in life, right? Oh my goodness. So I remember our conversations. A group of us leaders, I became a managing director in the organization. I had a territory of about 17 states, which was the largest in the country within Marsh for the small business division. And our conversations would revolve around a couple of things. We'd talk about what the bonus structure looked like this year. What did stock options look like this year? What did stock grants look like this year? This was funny, company cars. So you got, the company cars were rated in different levels, and based on where you were seniority in the company and position in the company, you got a nicer car. Wow, so one day I got a Lexus, and I thought, this is really cool. This is now fitting that image that I had for myself ever since that Paul Heavey comment. And then, back in 1996, we had the opportunity, Marsh acquired KBI, and many of you in the room remember KBI. We acquired them, and I had responsibility for that integration. But with that, some of us moved into their building, and in their building, they had a parking garage. Goodness, I got a spot in the parking garage. So here, everything's working, right? I've got all of the trappings going. I've got the car, I've got the income, I've got a parking garage, I've got the title. And just for good measure, I went through 4 country clubs. Started at Echo Valley, went to Hyperion, went to Glen Oaks, and finally ended up at Des Moines Golf and Country. Now, you might say I was a pretty stable young man, right? At this point, not at all. It was absurd at that point what I was going through. So you might imagine when these things become your small g gods, kind of where life ends up. And as I think back now and look at it, you know, I titled this kind of the results, please, because I was thinking about an award show when they hand you the envelope and saying, here are the results. Here are the results. I became, and I'm not sure I'd ever grown out of that at that point, I was a check-the-box Christian. So what does that mean, the check-the-box Christian? I went to church on Sunday, sat in the appropriate pew, gave the appropriate amount of money, and I was friends with the pastor. What more do you need to do, right? You spend that hour of the week and then go out the rest of your week and do what you do. There was absolutely no reason for me to be thinking any other way, okay? Because it worked. Had a lot of friends, all of those things. I dislike my job. What? How can that be? I had the dream job. Title, position, income, all of those things. I had the dream job. Why would I dislike my job? Might contentment be an issue here? I had zero contentment. Okay. So where does that lead, of course? And all the men in this group know exactly where that leads. It leads to dissatisfaction at home, because what I wanted in my life wasn't adding up, and so of course I brought that home with me in a significant way. And as you might imagine, there was a disastrous outcome. So this called for one thing as far as I was concerned. This called for a conversion. This called for a journey. It was time to start taking a different look at life. In 2004, I got fired. I got laid off. No, I got fired. Me and 6,000 of my closest friends got laid off from Marsh. Marsh had a lawsuit filed against it by, you all might remember the name Elliot Spitzer, who was the New York Attorney General at the time. He filed suit against Marsh based on the activities of 3 employees in a New York City office. When he did that, guess what happened to a publicly traded company's share price? It dived, split in half. That's a problem in a publicly traded company. And so me and 6,000 of my friends got let go to help ease that burden, the financial burden. Now, in all fairness, Marsh was wonderful, and I don't know if we've got any Marsh people in here, but Marsh was wonderful to us on the way out the door, and that was a bit of a challenge in its own way. So had a couple of months left in the office, had administrative support, and they did something else. They lifted non-compete agreements. And in the insurance world, anyone who's in that business understands that's a big deal. So we were able, a couple of us, to, in essence, take our books, start a new business called Barron's Management Group, and create a new business. Now, you would have thought losing the job, along with 6,000 friends, might have been a wake-up call, but no, because I was able to replicate things now into another business and move forward that way. So things weren't necessarily getting better at this point. I wasn't necessarily developing contentment with anything. Rather, discontentment continued to grow. So I'm still doing well financially. Now I have a different title. I'm president and founder of this group, and we've grown from two employees to 120 employees in 3 states. Wow, life is good again, right? Not at all. So along the way, now as we get to late 2008, 9, and 10, I'd gone through divorce. I had gone through some serious health issues. In 2012, I had my second open heart surgery. 9 hours on the operating table kind of makes you think differently about how you're handling your life. And so some changes had to be made. By the grace of God, I met my wife later in that time period, and Chong turned everything around, because here's this woman who had peaks and valleys in her life who suddenly started demonstrating what a relationship with Christ is like. And so I was really grateful for that, but I was kind of perplexed what that meant. And so she started to encourage me. She said, you know, again, nothing against the church you're going to now, which was across the street. She said, but you might like the messages you hear over at Hope. And I said, well, you don't understand. I said, if I go there, it doesn't count for my Sunday obligation. And she couldn't understand what I was talking about. But I finally, after haranguing me for months and months, I decided to come across the street. It was the longest part of my faith journey, is the walk across Ashworth Road. But I'm grateful I did it. And again, nothing to disparage, any past denominational affiliation, but it was just part of my growth. So I get over here, and there's this rather tall Norwegian pastor who's giving a message that day, and the message was about how you can't have any space between your daily life and Jesus Christ. And he entitled it, No Space. So that stuck with me. From that day forward, I thought, you know what? This is really an important piece that he's talking about. How do you do that? Because it was really a foreign concept to me. How do you not have this separation? How do you not just go to church for an hour a week and then go about your own business? And gradually over time, I started learning that's something you have to incorporate in your life. And as I started incorporating that in my life, I started realizing something else was happening. My contentment quotient was going up, which, again, how's this happen? It's foreign to me, a guy who was a check-the-box Christian. So I started down that road, and everything became no space in my life. Literally, those of you who know me and ever see me drive in a parking lot, my license plate says no space. I had a website that was the No Space website. I wrote a blog, the No Space blog, on and on, because I thought I discovered maybe the key to life, in that once we understand that Jesus is number one, and not just for 60 or 90 minutes on Sunday, it changes everything. It absolutely changes everything. So I got pretty excited about this. And so my wife, who's a pretty good influencer, talked me into going to a class here. It's a class that's not offered anymore, but it was called CORE. And I think Pastor Andy was one of the architects of that class. And a couple of things came out of it. The last assignment was come up with 2 things you're going to do to disciple. Now, that was a foreign concept. Disciple? How am I going to disciple? I don't understand anything, so I'll do a couple of things that just won't come true. And so one of those was, I'm going to create a men's Bible study. Now, if any of you, again, this isn't disparagement, but if anyone understands the Catholic tradition, there hasn't been traditionally a lot of Bible study. Okay, that's it. Again, you relied on your pastor to provide those snippets of the Bible. And so I thought, this is perfect. I'll ask a bunch of guys to be on a Bible study because I know their answer already. They'll say no, and I'm off the hook. So I go to the first guy with my very best sales technique, and I said, Steve, you don't want to join a men's Bible study, do you? And unfortunately, he said yes. He said, I really need that in my life. I go on to 15 other guys, and we eventually form a Bible study of 16 men that met every Saturday for the last 4 years at 7:30 in the morning. Thinking, how's this possible? Darn it, I didn't want this to happen, okay? Then I start going down this other media road, and that's another day, another story, but including the blog and website. And so now I'm becoming this other guy, kind of the guy I used to make a little fun of. You know, I was becoming this Jesus guy. But I also noticed it was changing my life over time, and I was pretty darn grateful for that. You know, as I think back, I shared with you the laundry list before of things that had become important to me. And then I went back to what the author had said. You know, while I was talking about bonuses, stock options, and grants, the author was talking about God's will for our vocation, whose plan is it, yours or God's. Our circumstances don't determine our contentment, but our faith and trust in God do. So I had failed miserably, but suddenly this no space mentality was changing everything. And it changed my heart, which was really cool to see that happen. So I've been kind of a slave, if you will, to titles over the course of the years. I talked about that a little bit, but as I look at kind of the parade of titles, this kind of shocked me when I was going through and prepping this slide. So I've had the good fortune of being a managing director, a president, a founder, a CEO. But now what do I find myself? I find myself a missions director, okay? And by the way, none of this is to suggest that this is the only vocational goal for anyone. I just happen to fall into this. So I'm a mission director at Lutheran Church of Hope. How cool is that, okay, from where I've been? Here's really the cool thing. So back in the March days, I called an old colleague of mine last night. I said, can you remind me about, I don't want to exaggerate, how big do you think my office was? He said, I don't know, 500, 600 square feet. I'm thinking, and it had a private restroom and a private conference room back in the day. Today, I sit in a work area with maybe 40 square feet of personal space, maybe at best. But I've never been more content in my life. And why is that? Again, it's not just because I work at a church. It's not that at all. It's because I've figured out in my life what's important, what builds contentment. And what builds contentment aren't titles, aren't toys. Okay, what builds contentment are the things that really matter to our soul. And as I learned that lesson, guess what? Life's become so much easier. So now, instead of always trying to live the Madison Avenue dream, now I'm content, okay? I'm content with doing the next right thing. I'm content with the thought, as I've aged, of finishing well. And I wish that on everyone in this room, that everyone is at that point or gets that point of finishing well. Again, there's so many folks in this room who could have delivered a great address on contentment, okay, because you've already reached it. Okay, congratulations if you're there. For those of you who aren't, keep working away at it. So, as I mentioned, I'm kind of a victim to marketing and advertising, and so I always had, in addition, and again, Andy's clever, he throws in this retirement part on me just because I'm old. So cover retirement as well as contentment. I've always viewed retirement in a certain way, and I think probably like a few of you in this room, if you really admit to it, kind of a way that the marketing mavens have presented to us. And so this kind of struck me. Take a look.
Hi, my name's Elaine.
Hi, my name is Elaine.
Hi, my name is Elaine.
Elaine is our name.
The village is like being on vacation every day.
The Disney World for retirees.
It is like going off to college.
You come here to live. You don't come here to pass away. There is no place like this. This is Nirvana.
So with all due respect and apologies to my friends who are down at the villages right now as we speak, it's kind of like the love of money, right? Okay, money isn't the root of all evil. The love of all money is the root of all evil. And it's the same with this. So for me, it was always the love of a certain image that was the root of all evil, not the actual thing. So again, my apologies to anyone who's watching online who has a place in the villages right now or is watching from there. That's not the point of this. The point of this is, what do we value? And so in retirement, this was my image forever. Right? This is where I wanted to be, because this is what all the advertisers told me how life needed to end up. And it's really a nice picture. But I can tell you, again, there's nothing wrong with a little bit of that, but if that's all that I'm about, if that's all that I'm about is getting to a certain image, what am I doing? I was talking with Tim Moline before coming up here this morning, and we were having this very conversation about what does retirement look like? And I'm not sure retirement is biblical, and my pastoral friends can correct me on all of this, and there's nothing wrong with slowing down, but I'd hate to think that at some point this is all. This can be a part of it, but if this is all that I'm looking ahead to. So it's been, and I look at time, I'm over. This has been an incredible journey on contentment, on faith, on no space in my life. And I've learned a lot. And I suspect there's a lot of other people in this room who could come up here and give this same testimony right now. But what I've learned is starting to value the important things. And so as I think about this, and as I thought about how do you end this presentation, because I've walked you through all the warts in my life, but how does it end? Does it end well for this guy from Dubuque? Does it end well from a family perspective? So here's contentment. The little guy's crying, as am I. Isn't it funny sometimes how God works? You know, remember before we were talking about 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 10? Okay, and how it sharpens you. Guess what it does? Some of these valleys sharpen you. And they certainly have in my life. I don't wish anyone to go through them, but I can tell you this. By going through them, I think I'm a better person today. And I think I have a little bit to offer yet, in addition to retirement. So I'm grateful to be here, grateful to be a part of this great organization at Lutheran Church of Hope, grateful to have an opportunity to come in and speak to a bunch of guys like you who are all so much more talented than I am, and all who could have delivered a better message today. But I'm grateful. And I just hope that somehow this touched one or many of your hearts, and it has a slight impact on how you treat your life going forward. We've all got it in us, I can tell you. We've all got it in us. I've been there, the lowest, and now, isn't it interesting, sitting in a 40 square foot cubicle, I've got contentment that I never had before. So I'm excited for that. I get to get involved with a lot of great organizations here locally, nationally, and across the globe. Life is pretty darn good. So thank you for your time this morning, and Andy told me I need to leave some questions, and so I looked at the author's questions, and I thought, okay, those are okay, Patrick M. Morley, but I wanted to go a little bit deeper, and I really hope you do. So I brought these questions, okay? And I think they're so important because we fool ourselves. So where do we find our contentment? Be honest as you're going through that. Who's your boss? I can tell you who mine was. Well, it was actually multiple. What's your plan to finish well? The age demographic in this room tilts a little bit on the higher side. What's your plan? And most importantly, the world's become black and white for me in the sense that we have three fundamental questions in life. Did Jesus come to this world? Did we kill him? And finally, did he rise from the dead? If that's true, it changes everything because we live in a black and white world then. There's no middle ground there. There's no, oh, he might have, he might not have. No, sorry, can't take the gray way out. It either happened or he didn't. He either died and rose or he didn't. And if we truly believe that in all of our hearts, okay, that he rose from the dead, it has to change the way we live our lives. And gosh, I wish it wouldn't have taken me about 53 or 4 years to discover that, and finally over the last 12 years or so to really understand it. But that's life, okay? And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for all of you this morning. Appreciate your time and patience and attention, and have a great day. Thank you.